Number 10. Kosovo, 1389. The battle that gave Europe its first taste of what was coming. Sultan Murad I is not a name most Westerners know. In 1389, he should have been. He was 63 years old, the third ruler of the Ottoman dynasty, and he had spent 27 years turning a small warband on the edge of Anatolia into the dominant power of the Balkans. He had taken Adrianople and made it his capital. He had crossed the Maritsa River and shattered a Serbian army so completely in 1371 that the Serbian Empire simply broke apart into feuding princes. By the spring of 1389, only one of those princes still stood in his way. Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović, ruler of Moravian Serbia, had done something his neighbors had not managed. He had built a coalition, Osnians under Vlatko Vuković, Wallachians, Bulgarians, Serbian nobility from Vuk Brankovic's domain, even Czech mercenaries who had marched across half of Europe for the pay and the pardons. When Murad turned his army north in the summer of 1389, he was not marching against a Serbian prince. He was marching against the last unified Christian army the Balkans could still put in the field. The two forces met on a wide plain northwest of Pristina on June 15th, a plain that the Serbs called Kosovo Polje, the field of the blackbirds. Modern estimates put Murad's army at somewhere between 27,000 and 40,000. Lazar's coalition was smaller, perhaps 15,000 to 25,000, though centuries of Serbian folk tradition would swell that number towards something more heroic. The battle opened in a way medieval battles rarely did. Ottoman archers loosed their arrows into the advancing Serbian cavalry. The heavy Serbian knights, armor scrapes shining plowed through the arrow storm and struck the Ottoman left wing so hard that Prince Jakub Celebi's forces buckled. For an hour, perhaps, two, it looked as if Christian Europe was about to win the most important victory since the First Crusade. Then a Serbian knight named Milos Obilic did something that has haunted the Ottoman court for 600 years. Accounts differ. Some say Obilic pretended to be a deserter. Others say he was wounded and lying among the fallen when Murad walked past. What everyone agrees on is this. Obilic got close enough to the Sultan to drive a blade into him. Murad I, conqueror of Adrianople, breaker of the Serbian Empire, died on the ground where his boots had been standing. And, for a moment, the entire Ottoman command structure teetered. But Bayezid, Murad's eldest son, did not teeter. He was 29 years old, and he had a nickname his enemies would come to hate, Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. Bayezid took command of the army before news of his father's death had even spread beyond the tent. His first act was practical. He had his younger brother, Jakub, summoned and strangled with a bowstring. There would be no succession war while the Serbs were still on the field. His second act was total war. He committed his reserves, personally led the counterattack, and by evening the Serbian coalition had collapsed. Prince Lazar was captured alive. Bayezid had him beheaded on the spot as revenge for his father. Vlatko Vuković escaped with what remained of the Bosnian contingent, but the Serbian nobility was gone. An entire generation of Balkan Christian leadership had died in a single afternoon. Kosovo mattered for reasons that went far beyond the casualty count. It broke Serbia forever. Lazar's widow, Milica, would soon be sending her daughter Olivera to Bayezid's harem as part of the vassalage settlement. It also gave the Ottoman Empire something more valuable than territory. It gave them terror. The story of Kosovo traveled faster than any Ottoman army. In Florence, in Paris, in Vienna. In Krakow, men who had never seen a Turk began to understand that a new kind of enemy had arrived. Not raiders, not sultans of a passing dynasty. An imperial machine that killed kings and kept marching. Serbian bards began composing epic poems about the battle within a generation. By the 19th century, Kosovo would become the founding myth of Serbian nationhood, celebrated every June 28th on Vidovdan St. Vitus Day. But in 1389, in the immediate aftermath, only one thing mattered. The Ottoman Empire had swallowed Serbia, and it was hungry for more. Number 9, Nicopolis, 1396. The last great crusade of the Middle Ages annihilated in an afternoon. Bayezid I, the man who had strangled his brother at Kosovo, had earned his nickname. In the 7 years after his father's death, the Thunderbolt had done more damage to Christian Europe than any Muslim ruler since Saladin. He forced the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II to become his personal vassal and to fight in his army against fellow Christians in Anatolia. He besieged Constantinople itself, cutting off supplies and starving the city for years. He crossed the Danube, he raided into Hungary, he took Bulgaria apart piece by piece. By 1394, Pope Boniface IX was doing something no pope had done in almost a century. He was preaching a crusade. This was not a small affair. This was the last serious attempt of Western Christendom to fight the way it had fought in the age of Richard the Lionheart. King Sigismund of Hungary, later Holy Roman Emperor, took the cross first. Then came the nobility of France, the crown jewel of medieval chivalry led by John of Nevers, the young son of the Duke of Burgundy, later known to history as John the Fearless. With John rode Philip of Artois, Enguerrand of Coucy, one of the greatest French knights of the age, Boucicaut, the Marshal of France. Contingents came from Germany, Bohemia, Croatia, Wallachia, under Mircea the Elder, and from the Knights Hospitaller. In total, perhaps 16,000 crusaders assembled on the Danube in the summer of 1396, though contemporary chronicles inflated the number toward $100,000, in the way medieval chroniclers always did. They marched down the Danube in high spirits. They sacked the Bulgarian towns of Vidin and Rahova. Rahova was the first sign of what this crusade was going to be. When the town's Muslim garrison surrendered, the French knights slaughtered them. Then they slaughtered a significant portion of the Christian civilian population as well, because the Christians had not risen up against the Ottomans when the Crusaders arrived. This was the mood. Arrogant, drunk, murderous, and completely convinced that the Turks would collapse at the sight of European armor. On September 12th, the crusade reached Nicopolis, a fortress town perched high above the Danube in modern Bulgaria. The town was well defended and impossible to storm without proper siege engines, which the Crusaders had not brought. So they settled in to starve the garrison out, and they behaved as they had behaved since Vidin. Feasts, tournaments among themselves, rampant looting of the countryside. King Sigismund's Hungarian scouts brought warnings that Bayezid was moving north with a large army. The French laughed. Everyone knew Bayezid was busy besieging Constantinople. He could not possibly leave. Bayezid did leave. He marched more than 900 kilometers in less than 2 weeks, one of the fastest large-scale military movements of the entire medieval period. On September 24th, his scouts made contact with the Crusader camp. On September 25th, he was on the Crusaders. Sigismund proposed a defensive battle. Let the Hungarians and Wallachians hold the front while the French formed a reserve to smash any breakthrough. It was the correct plan. The French rejected it. Philip of Artois screamed at Sigismund's messenger that the King of Hungary was trying to steal the honor of the French nobility. The French would charge first, and they would charge alone if they had to. What happened next was murder on horseback. The French knights charged uphill into a screen of Ottoman light cavalry and archers, and they charged hard. The screen fell back. Then the knights hit a line of sharpened wooden stakes, planted in the ground exactly the kind of anti-cavalry defense the Ottomans had learned to build. Against them, horses impaled themselves, others reared and threw their riders. And still the French kept coming. They fought their way through the stakes, hacked down the stunned Ottoman archers, and reached the crest of the ridge. At the crest, they discovered that they had not fought the Ottoman army, they had fought the vanguard. Bayezid's main body of infantry and his janissaries were waiting on the reverse slope, and 5,000 Serbian cavalry under Prince Stefan Lazarevic, the son of the man beheaded at Kosovo, was moving to flank them. The French collapsed. Some ran, some fought to the death. Most were captured. Sigismund and the Hungarians tried to counterattack when they saw the French banners falling, but they were now attacking uphill against a fully deployed Ottoman army. The Wallachians and Transylvanians, seeing the disaster unfold, simply left the field. Sigismund himself escaped on a fishing boat down the Danube. It took him almost a year to reach home by sailing all the way through the Aegean, Constantinople, and up the Adriatic. What happened after the battle is what turned Nicopolis into a nightmare that echoed for a century. Bayezid had lost heavily in the assault, thousands of his best troops, and when he learned that the Crusaders had massacred their Muslim prisoners at Rahova, he answered in kind. On the morning after the battle, prisoners were brought before him in groups. Estimates of the numbers executed vary wildly. The chronicler Froissart, cautious, said 300. The Religieux of Saint Denis said 3,000. Johann Schiltberger, a 16-year-old Bavarian squire who was there, said 10,000. Whatever the true number, it was a slaughter that lasted from morning until late afternoon. Only nobles who could pay ransoms were spared. Boucicaut, John of Nevers, a handful of the very rich, Enguerrand of Coucy died in captivity a year later. Philip of Artois died in captivity too. Schultberger, spared because of his youth, would spend the next 32 years wandering as a slave from the Ottoman court to Timur's court in Central Asia before finally getting home to Bavaria to write it all down. Nicopolis broke the crusading movement. There would be smaller campaigns in the 15th century, but nothing on this scale. The flower of French chivalry had ridden east with lances gilded and banners flying and had come back as heads on pikes. Every king in Europe now knew what Bayezid had proven. Western armored cavalry, the terror of medieval battlefields, was not enough. Number 8, Varna, 1444, the battle that killed the king and killed Constantinople with him. By 1444, half a century had passed since Nicopolis. The Ottomans had been through hell and come out stronger. Timur the Lame had smashed Bayezid at Ankara in 1402, taken him prisoner, and left the Ottoman Empire in ruins. For 20 years, the sons of Bayezid tore each other apart in a civil war that historians call the Interregnum. But by 1444, the empire had been rebuilt under Sultan Murad II. Constantinople was ringed by Ottoman territory on every side. The Byzantine emperor was reduced to a mayor of a starving city. Serbia was a vassal. Bulgaria was gone. And into this darkness, one final crusade was launched. It was led by an unlikely pair, Vladislav III of Poland, the young king of both Poland and Hungary. He was 20 years old, blonde, deeply pious, and terrified of what would happen if Constantinople fell. Alongside him rode the man who was already becoming a legend across Christian Europe, John Hunyadi, the voivode of Transylvania. Hunyadi had spent the past 3 years fighting the Ottomans with a series of small, brilliant victories. In 1443, he had led the so-called Long Campaign deep into Bulgaria, reaching almost to Sofia before winter forced him back. In the summer of 1444, Hungary and Sultan Murad II signed the Peace of Sage, a 10-year truce. Peace. Then the cardinal legate, Julian Cesarini, arrived from Rome with instructions from the Pope. The truce was invalid, Cesarini argued, because it had been sworn to an infidel. Murad II had actually abdicated a few months earlier in favor of his 12-year-old son Mehmed. If the Crusaders struck now, they would face a boy on the throne of a fractured empire. King Vladislav agreed. The truce, barely a month old, was torn up. The Crusade of Varna marched east in September 1444 with perhaps 20,000 troops. It moved fast, expecting to strike before Murad could return. But Murad returned. When the news reached the retired sultan in Anatolia, he crossed the Bosphorus, marched north, and reached the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria with an army of somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 men, more than double the Crusaders' force. The Venetians, who had been paid to blockade the Bosphorus and prevent exactly this, had let him cross. Some sources say the Ottomans bribed Genoese ships to ferry them across at a ducat a soldier. Either way, on November 10th, 1444, the Crusaders discovered they had been outmaneuvered and outnumbered. The battle was fought on marshy ground west of the Black Sea port of Varna, with the Crusaders in a Wagenburg, a defensive circle of war wagons chained together, and the Ottomans deploying in their traditional crescent formation, with the Sultan and his janissaries anchoring the center. For much of the day, the fight went well for the Christians. Hunyadi personally led counterattacks that shattered the Ottoman right and left wings. The Anatolian Sipahis broke and fled. The Rumeilian cavalry was pushed back on the Sultan's guard. For a moment, it was 1396 in reverse. The Crusaders were about to win. Then Vladislav III made a decision that changed European history. He was 20 years old. He watched Hunyadi win the flanks, and he wanted his own share of the glory. He rallied his personal guard, 500 Polish and Hungarian knights, and he led a direct charge at Sultan Murad II and the wall of janissaries protecting him. The charge was magnificent. The 500 crashed into the janissaries and cut their way through the first line. Then the second. Vladislav was within reach of the Sultan's own tent. Some accounts say Murad was already turning his horse to flee. Then Vladislav's horse tripped, or was speared, or slipped in the mud. The young king went down. A janissary named Koja Hazar reached him first and struck off his head with a single blow of his yataghan, a curved Ottoman blade designed for exactly this kind of work. Hazar picked up the head, ran back to the Ottoman lines, and presented it as a gift. Murad II ordered it mounted on a pike and paraded up and down the front. The effect on the Crusaders was catastrophic. The morale of the Christian army collapsed when they saw their king's head above the Ottoman lines. Hunyadi tried to hold them together, tried to rally a fighting retreat. It was hopeless. The Ottomans surged forward, and the Christian army came apart. Perhaps 15,000 Crusaders died. Cardinal Cesarini, who had torn up the peace treaty, was killed in the rout. Legend says he was murdered by his own troops in revenge. Hunyadi escaped with a handful of survivors. Vladislav's body was never found. For years afterward, rumors spread across Poland and Hungary that the young king had survived, that he had wandered Europe in disguise, that he lived as a hermit on Madeira. Medieval Europe loved missing kings almost as much as it loved dead ones. But he was gone, and with him died the last realistic hope of saving Constantinople. Because of Varna, when Mehmed II arrived at the walls of the Byzantine capital 9 years later, no field army came to relieve it. There was no one left to send. Number 7. Kosovo Polje, 1448, Hunyadi's last chance, a 3-day meat grinder, and the death of Byzantine Europe. 4 years after Varna, John Hunyadi tried again. He was one of the most stubborn men in Christian history. Everything he had built had died with Vladislav III. Poland was under a different king. Hungary was ruled by an infant. Cesarini was dead. The papacy was distracted. But Hunyadi kept fighting. In the 4 years after Varna, he rebuilt the Hungarian army almost by force of personality alone. He recruited across Central Europe. He wrote to the Pope, to Venice, to Aragon, to Naples, begging for help. Most refused. He wrote to a man he had never met, a young Albanian warlord named George Castrioti, better known to history as Skanderbeg, who had been fighting his own war against the Ottomans in the mountains of Albania since 1443. Skanderbeg agreed to join him. By the autumn of 1448, Hunyadi believed he was ready. His plan was simple and audacious. He would march south through Serbia, link up with Skanderbeg's Albanians, and destroy the main Ottoman army in a single decisive battle before Sultan Murad II could react. Everything depended on speed, everything depended on secrecy. Hunyadi had neither. Serbian despot George Brankovic, still technically an Ottoman vassal despite being Christian, refused to let the Hungarian army pass through his territory. Hunyadi crossed anyway. Brankovic sent messengers to Murad II, warning him exactly where the Hungarians were coming from and how many they had. When Hunyadi arrived on the Kosovo plain, the same field where the Serbs had died in 1389, he was expecting an empty landscape. Instead, he found Murad II waiting for him with an army twice his size, perhaps 60,000 Ottomans against 22,000 to 30,000 Crusaders. Skanderbeg was still on the road. The battle began on October 17th, 1448, and it did not end for 3 days. It was one of the largest and longest field battles of the entire medieval period. Hunyadi commanded the center with his Hungarian infantry and heavy cavalry. Wallachian troops under Dan II held the right wing. On the Ottoman side, Murad commanded the center, with his son Mehmed II, the future conqueror of Constantinople, leading the Anatolian right wing in his first battle. Day 1 was mostly skirmishing. Hungarian long cannons hammered the Ottoman lines. Ottoman archers picked at the Hungarian formations. When night fell, both armies slept in place. Day 2 was slaughter. Hunyadi attacked the Ottoman flanks with his mixed cavalry and shattered the Ottoman left. His Hungarian knights broke through the Ottoman center and reached the tent of Sultan Murad himself before being stopped at the Ottoman camp by the Janissary Reserve. If Skanderbeg had arrived that afternoon, the battle would have ended differently. He had not arrived. Murad had already sent an army under Mustafa Pasha to intercept the Albanians and hold them in the mountains. Skanderbeg was still 32 kilometers away when the second day of battle ended. Day 3 was the killing floor. The Wallachian right wing under Dan II either broke or, as some sources say, actively defected to the Ottoman side. The Ottoman cavalry poured into the gap. The Hungarian formation was surrounded. Hunyadi's center held for hours. Contemporary Ottoman historians wrote that no European army had ever fought with such stubbornness. But surrounded is surrounded. By evening on October 20th, the Hungarian army was destroyed. Estimates vary. Bonfini, the Italian chronicler, said 8,000 crusaders dead against 30,000 Ottomans. The Ottoman side reported 4,000 of their own dead. A body count on the field afterward reached around 17,000 corpses total. Hunyadi himself escaped through the Ottoman lines in the chaos, but he was captured on his way home by Brankovic, the Serbian despot who held him for ransom until Hunyadi paid 100,000 florins and promised to marry his own son to Brankovic's granddaughter, Skanderbeg. Hearing that the battle was lost, turned around and marched back to Albania. What made Second Kosovo the true funeral of Byzantine Europe was not the casualty count. It was that Hunyadi had emptied every barrel. He had spent Hungary's last reserves on this campaign. He had called in every favor, drawn on every alliance, gambled everything on one throw, and he had lost. When Mehmed II, the boy who fought his first battle at Kosovo in 1448, marched on Constantinople in 1453, there was no field army waiting to relieve it. There would not be one. Hunyadi lived until 1456 and won one more miraculous victory at Belgrade against Mehmed himself, saving Hungary and buying Christian Europe another 70 years. But the age of the Great Crusades was over. From now on, Europe would fight in fortresses. Number 6. Rhodes, 1522, when 7,000 knights held out against 100,000 Ottomans for 6 months and won the enemy's respect. In 1522, a young sultan had a problem. Suleiman I, called by his own subjects the Lawgiver, and by the West the Magnificent, was 27 years old and had inherited the throne of the world's most powerful state 2 years earlier. His father, Selim I, had doubled the empire's size in 8 years. Suleiman needed to prove he could match him. He looked at the map of the Mediterranean, and one island stared back at him: Rhodes. For 200 years, the small rocky island off the coast of Anatolia had been the headquarters of one of the strangest military orders in Christian history, the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, the Knights Hospitaller. Founded in the First Crusade to run a hospital in Jerusalem for pilgrims, the order had been driven from Jerusalem from Acre, from Cyprus, and had finally established itself on Rhodes in 1309. From there, they had done exactly one thing for 2 centuries. They had preyed on Muslim shipping. Their galleys hunted every Ottoman merchant ship that dared cross the Aegean. Their forts commanded the sea lanes between Constantinople and Egypt. And every year they took hundreds of Muslim prisoners and sold them as galley slaves. Sultan Mehmed II had tried to end them in 1480 and failed. Now Suleiman would try again. In June 1522, an Ottoman fleet of over 400 ships arrived off Rhodes, carrying an invasion force estimated between 100 and 200,000 men, though the true fighting strength was probably closer to 100,000. Against them stood roughly 6,700 defenders, around 500 Knights of the Order, drawn from every country of Catholic Europe: English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, about 1,500 mercenaries. The rest were Rhodian civilians who took up whatever weapons they could find. The Grand Master was Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, a French nobleman elected the year before. He knew what he had inherited. He had spent his first year strengthening the walls, stockpiling grain, and hiring a brilliant Italian military engineer named Gabriele Tadino da Martinengo, who slipped through the Ottoman blockade to reach Rhodes and take charge of the defense. What followed was one of the most technically sophisticated sieges of the 16th century. The Ottomans could not simply storm the walls. Rhodes had been rebuilt since 1480, with the newest style of defense: low, thick-sloped walls designed specifically to absorb cannon fire. Instead, the Ottomans dug. Ottoman miners tunneled underneath the Rhodian walls to plant gunpowder charges and blow them apart. Martinengo's Rhodian counterminers dug back at them. The sieges of the 16th century were often won or lost in dark tunnels 15 meters below the earth, where men fought with knives and short spears by the light of a single lantern. By September, sections of the walls were coming down. The Ottomans launched massive assaults, sending waves of janissaries against the breaches. The knights held, then they held again, then they held a third time. By late September, Suleiman was in a rage. He had lost tens of thousands of men. He fired his top commander, Çoban Mustafa Pasha, and nearly executed him on the spot. He replaced him with Ahmed Pasha, an engineer, and still the walls held. It went on for 6 months. Autumn turned to winter. The Ottomans lost tens of thousands to combat and disease, perhaps 50,000 dead from illness alone, by Christian estimates. The defenders lost their doctors, their chaplains, their families. By December, only about 180 knights were still on their feet. Ammunition was running out. Bread was running out. On December 18th, Vizier de Lila Dama, a man who had watched almost all of his knights die around him, finally opened negotiations. Suleiman offered generous terms. The knights could leave with their weapons, their banners, and their honor. Any Rhodian who wanted to leave with them could go. Any who stayed would be exempt from Ottoman taxes for 5 years. On January 1st, 1523, the surviving knights marched out of the ruins of Rhodes and boarded ships that would carry them west, eventually to a rocky island the Emperor Charles V would give them in 1530. Malta. Suleiman is said to have watched Villiers de l'Isle Adam pass and remarked to an aide, "It is not without some pain that I obliged this Christian at his age to leave his home." He would regret his generosity for the rest of his life. Number 5, Mohács, 1526. When the Kingdom of Hungary died in under 2 hours. Everything changed on August 29th, 1526. Hungary had been the shield of Central Europe for a century. From the days of John Hunyadi's stand at Belgrade in 1456 to the reign of his son Matthias Corvinus, no Christian kingdom had blunted more Ottoman offensives. But Matthias died in 1490, and his kingdom had been decaying ever since. By 1526, Hungary was ruled by a 20-year-old king named Louis II, who had been crowned when he was 2, married when he was 16, and who ruled 2 kingdoms, Hungary and Bohemia, that neither wanted him nor listened to him. Suleiman marched north with an army of somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 men, dragging with him hundreds of cannon and a professional siege train that could reduce castles to rubble in days. He crossed the Drava River on a pontoon bridge that took his engineers 5 days to build. Louis waited for him on a marshy plain near a small town called Mohács on the west bank of the Danube. Louis had perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 men. He was outnumbered at least 2 to 1, more likely 3 to 1. His most important vassal, John Zapolya of Transylvania, was marching to join him with another 15,000 to 20,000, and Louis knew this. Every officer in the Hungarian camp begged him to wait. The Archbishop of Kalocsa, Pál Tomori, who commanded the Hungarian army in the field, actually agreed with the young king that they should attack immediately. He believed a lightning strike could shatter the Ottoman vanguard before Suleiman deployed. It was the wrong decision. On the afternoon of August 29th, the Hungarian army advanced across the marshy plain toward the Ottoman line, which was still coming down off the ridge above them. The Hungarian cavalry, still one of the finest in Europe, hit the Ottoman vanguard with tremendous force. For the first 30 minutes, it worked. The Rumelian troops of the vanguard were pushed back. The Hungarian knights broke through and drove toward the Ottoman center, where they found Suleiman and his janissaries and his artillery. The Ottoman guns had been chained together in a long line to prevent them from being overrun by cavalry, and behind them stood the janissaries. What happened next was the moment 16th century warfare changed. The Ottoman artillery opened fire at point-blank range on the charging Hungarian cavalry. Hundreds of horses and men went down in a single volley. The Hungarian formation shattered. The janissaries poured musket fire into the survivors. And then, from either flank, Ottoman light cavalry swept around and completed the encirclement. The Hungarian army was destroyed in under 2 hours. Perhaps 14,000 to 24,000 Hungarian soldiers died in the killing, including something like 1,000 nobles, 7 bishops, and both of the army's commanders. Then Suleiman ordered the execution of another 2,000 prisoners on the spot the next morning. King Louis II tried to escape north across the Seles stream, a small creek that fed into the Danube. His horse fell in the mud, or he fell trying to climb the far bank. Weighed down by his armor, the 20-year-old king of Hungary in Bohemia drowned in water perhaps a meter deep, alone with nobody to pull him out. His body was found weeks later. In Hungary, they still say a sentence that no other country in Europe says quite the same way. Törb is Veset Mohács now. More was lost at Mohács. It became shorthand for national annihilation. Louis had no heir. The Kingdom of Hungary, one of the great powers of medieval Europe, ceased to exist as an independent state. It would be divided among three claimants. The Ottomans took central Hungary. The Habsburgs took the western strip. John Zapolya, who had never arrived at Mohács, took Transylvania and would spend the rest of his life as an Ottoman client. Suleiman marched to Buda, sacked it, and took over 100,000 Hungarians away as slaves. He did not garrison the country, not yet. He knew he did not have to. Central Europe now lay open to him, and there was only one thing between him and the Rhine, a city called Vienna. Number 4. Vienna, 1529, the high water mark. The Ottomans at the walls of the Habsburg capital, defeated by rain, mud, and October. In the summer of 1529, Suleiman set out to finish what he had started at Mohács 3 years earlier. His target was Vienna, capital of Ferdinand, the first brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the newest ruler of the fragmented rump of Hungary. If Vienna fell, the Danube Valley opened all the way to Bavaria. The German heartland lay bare. Every prince in the Holy Roman Empire understood what was coming. Suleiman marched from Constantinople on May 10th with an army that contemporaries put at 200,000 to 300,000 men, though modern historians estimate the fighting force at closer to 120,000. And this is where the weather began. The spring of 1529 was one of the wettest in Central European memory. The Sultan's army marched into a wall of rain that did not stop for months. Roads dissolved. Rivers flooded. Pack camels died by the thousand from cold and disease. The heavy siege artillery, the cannons that had smashed the walls of Rhodes and turned the Hungarian cavalry into a red mist at Mohács, sank into the mud and could not be moved. Suleiman was forced to leave most of them behind in Belgrade. He was marching on the Habsburg capital with an army designed to smash walls and no wall-smashing artillery. Vienna's defenders knew he was coming. Archduke Ferdinand had fled to Prague, but he left behind the professional soldier Nicholas Graf Salm, a 70-year-old veteran of the Italian wars, and about 17,000 to 21,000 soldiers. Salm did what desperate men do. He tore down every building outside the walls to deny the Ottomans cover. He burned villages within a day's ride of the city. He stockpiled every scrap of grain in the countryside. He blocked the Danube to prevent the Ottomans bringing artillery upriver. And he waited. Suleiman arrived on September 27th. He had already lost around 30,000 men to the march. Ottoman camps sprawled across the plain outside the walls. On the Ottoman side, mining began immediately. If Suleiman could not blast the walls, he would tunnel under them. On October 6th, the Viennese launched a sortie of 8,000 men that destroyed most of the Ottoman mining works but suffered heavy casualties in the retreat. On October 9th and 10th, Ottoman mines finally opened breaches in the walls. Assaults poured through. The defenders, using long pikes and arquebuses, cut them down from the ramparts. On October 12th, over 1,200 Janissaries died in a single failed assault. And then, on October 14th, Suleiman ordered one last massive attack, offering huge cash bounties to any soldier who breached the walls. It also failed. The next day, Suleiman ordered his army to break camp. Snow was already falling. His supply lines were breaking down. Disease was killing his troops as fast as the Viennese muskets. His engineers reported the walls would take weeks more to breach. He simply did not have weeks. The retreat became a nightmare. Habsburg light cavalry hunted the Ottoman rearguard. Escaped prisoners rejoined their liberators. Snow buried the wounded. Estimates say only a fraction of Suleiman's original army made it back to Constantinople alive. Officially, Suleiman claimed he had achieved his objectives. He had not intended to take Vienna. He had come only to punish Ferdinand. Nobody in Europe or the Ottoman court believed him. Vienna, 1529, was the moment when the Ottoman tide reached its high water mark on European soil. Every retreat that followed for 236 years, until the final treaty of 1699 and beyond, began at those walls in the reign of October 1529. Number 3, Malta, 1565. The great siege that answered floating crucifixes with cannonballs made of human heads. 43 years after Rhodes, Suleiman the Magnificent still had not forgiven himself. The knights he had let sail away in 1523 had rebuilt their order on the barren rocks of Malta, and from Malta they had done exactly what they had done from Rhodes. They preyed on Muslim shipping, they raided the North African coast, they took thousands of Muslim slaves for their galleys. By 1565, they were commanded by a man who was, if anything, older and more stubborn than Suleiman himself. Jean Parisot de Valette, Grand Master of the Order, was 70 years old. He had personally fought at Rhodes as a young knight. He had spent time as an Ottoman galley slave after being captured at sea, and he had spent his old age making Malta into the toughest fortress in the Mediterranean. In May 1565, an Ottoman fleet of nearly 200 ships and around 40,000 troops arrived off the island. In command was Mustafa Pasha, an experienced siege general. His naval counterpart was Piale Pasha. And on his way from North Africa came the legendary corsair Dragut, Turgut Reis, one of the greatest naval commanders in Ottoman history. Against them stood roughly 500 knights of the order, around 400 Spanish and Italian soldiers, and perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 Maltese militia. Somewhere between 8,000 to 9,000 defenders, in total, most of them ordinary Maltese farmers and fishermen, who had chosen to fight beside the order. They were outnumbered at least 4-1. What followed was the bloodiest siege of the 16th century. The Ottomans focused first on a small, isolated fort called St. Elmo, guarding the entrance to Malta's Grand Harbor. Mustafa Pasha assumed it would fall in a few days. It held for a month. Every night, the defenders in St. Angelo, the main fort across the water, rode reinforcements across the harbor to the crumbling walls of St. Elmo, knowing the men they carried were going to their deaths. When St. Elmo finally fell on June 23rd, the Ottomans had lost around 6,000 men, including half of their elite janissaries. Dragut himself had been mortally wounded by a splinter from a cannonball impact, either enemy fire or a friendly fire accident. No one is sure. The Ottomans took St. Elmo, but they were bleeding. And now, Mustafa Pasha did something that would come to define this siege in Christian memory. He ordered the bodies of the dead knights decapitated, their limbs cut off, their torsos nailed to wooden crosses. Those crosses were then thrown into the harbor to float across the water toward the walls of St. Angelo, where the defenders would find them the next morning. It was meant to break their will. Valette was 70 years old, and it did not break him. He ordered every Ottoman prisoner in the St. Angelo dungeons brought up and beheaded on the walls. Their heads were then loaded into cannons and fired back across the harbor into the Ottoman camp. This was the message. There would be no surrender. There would be no quarter. This was a war of annihilation, and Malta had chosen annihilation over defeat. The siege went on for another 2.5 months. Assault after assault, mine after countermine. On July 15th, an amphibious attack on the Senglea Peninsula lost the Ottomans nearly 800 men when boats crossing the harbor came into the range of a hidden battery on St. Angelo. 2 salvos sank all but one of the invading boats. In early August, a mine exploded under the walls of Birgu, and Mustafa Pasha personally led his janissaries into the breach. The 70-year-old Valette himself picked up a helmet, drew his sword, and led the counterattack, wounded in the leg but refusing to leave the wall. The janissaries broke. By September, the Ottoman army was dying. It had lost perhaps a third of its strength to fighting and disease. Food was running out. The Maltese weather was turning. And on September 7th, a Christian relief force finally arrived from Sicily. Only 8,000 men, but it was enough. Mustafa Pasha, hearing that the relief had landed, panicked. He ordered a hasty embarkation. Then, when he learned the relief force was smaller than he thought, he tried to land again to fight them and was routed. On 9/11, the Ottoman fleet sailed away. Perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 Ottoman soldiers had died over 4 months. Around a third of the defenders were also dead, including 219 of the 500 knights. Malta had held. When Suleiman, back in Constantinople, learned the news, he is said to have muttered that only in his own hand would his sword succeed. He was preparing to lead another army west himself when he died the following year at the Siege of Sightvar. The Great Siege of Malta became legend across Christian Europe within weeks. Voltaire, 200 years later, wrote that nothing is better known than the Siege of Malta. It bought Christian Europe another century of naval survival, and it broke for a generation the aura of Ottoman invincibility at sea. Number 2, Lepanto, 1571. The largest galley battle in history. 40,000 dead in 5 hours. And the wound that made Miguel de Cervantes. On the morning of October 7th, 1571, in the Gulf of Patras off the western coast of Greece, two of the largest fleets ever assembled in the Mediterranean rowed toward each other. On one side, the Holy League. Spain, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, Savoy, Tuscany, Malta, Urbino. A coalition welded together by Pope Pius V after the Ottomans invaded Cyprus, then a Venetian possession, and slaughtered the garrison at Famagusta. Around 206 galleys and 6 massive Venetian galleasses, floating fortresses of firepower. Total crews of around 40,000 sailors and rowers, with 28,500 fighting soldiers. The fleet was commanded by a 24-year-old prince, Don John of Austria, the illegitimate half-brother of King Philip II of Spain. He had never commanded a fleet in his life. On the other side, the Ottoman navy under Ali Pasha, called Muezzin Zaid, because he had trained as a religious singer. Around 251 galleys, 40 or so smaller, ships roughly 88,000 men, including 34,000 fighting soldiers. Ali Pasha did not want to fight that day. His fleet was tired. Many of his best Janissaries had already been sent home for winter. But Sultan Selim II had ordered him to seek battle, so he sought it. The two fleets deployed in vast crescents, mirror images of each other. In the center, Don John and Ali Pasha faced each other directly, their flagships aiming for one another. On the Christian right, Andrea Doria, the Genoese admiral. On the left, the Venetian Agostino Barbarigo. And in the reserve, the Spanish Marquis of Santa Cruz. The battle began at midday. The Venetian galleasses, towed into position ahead of the main line, opened fire with heavy broadside guns and immediately sank several Ottoman ships in the first minutes. On the Christian left, Barbarigo took an arrow through the eye and died on his own quarterdeck. But his squadron held. In the center, Ali Pasha's flagship rammed Don John's reel. The two crews boarded each other. It was hand-to-hand slaughter across the decks, Spanish infantry against Janissaries for hours. Twice the Spanish were pushed back to the flagship's mast. Twice they surged forward again. On the third attempt, they reached the Ottoman flagship. Ali Pasha was killed by a musket ball or beheaded in the fighting. Sources differ. His head was hoisted on a pike from the reel. When the Ottoman fleet saw the flagship's mast fall, morale collapsed. On the Christian right, Andrea Doria was pulled out of position by an Ottoman flanking maneuver, and for an hour it looked as if the Christian line might be turned. Santa Cruz brought up the reserve and stabilized the line. By 4 in the afternoon, the battle was over. Out of 251 Ottoman ships, roughly 50 escaped. The rest were sunk, burned, or captured. Ottoman casualties were catastrophic, perhaps 25,000 to 30,000 dead. Around 15,000 Christian galley slaves who had been chained to Ottoman oars were freed. The Christians lost around 7,500 to 9,000 dead. Perhaps 20,000 wounded. One of the wounded was a 24-year-old Spanish soldier serving as a marine on the galley Marquesa. He had been sick with fever that morning. He had begged to be allowed to fight anyway. He had been shot 3 times, twice in the chest, and once in the left forearm. The wound to the arm cost him the use of his left hand for the rest of his life. He would carry the nickname El Manco de Lepanto, the one-handed man of Lepanto, until he died in 1616. His name was Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. He would later write Don Quixote, considered by many the first modern novel. He said until his last day that Lepanto was the greatest event witnessed by ages past, present, or to come. Lepanto did not end Ottoman naval power. Within a year, the Ottomans had rebuilt a fleet of over 200 galleys. The Venetians surrendered Cyprus in 1573. But the psychological effect on Europe was immeasurable. For the first time in more than a century, a Christian navy had won a major fleet action against the Ottomans. It broke the myth. Church bells rang from Sicily to Antwerp. Pope Pius V instituted a new feast day, Our Lady of Victory, later Our Lady of the Rosary, celebrated every October 7th. And for anyone who had grown up believing the Ottoman tide could not be stopped October 7th, 1571, was a very loud answer. Number 1. Vienna, 1683, the battle where 18,000 horses came down a mountain and the 300 years ended. In the late summer of 1683, an Ottoman army came to Vienna a second time. It had been 154 years since Suleiman's failure. In those years, the Ottoman Empire had reached even deeper into Hungary. It had taken parts of Ukraine, but it had also grown sclerotic, its leadership divided between palace factions, its army increasingly reliant on quantity over quality. In 1683, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha convinced the young Sultan Mehmed IV to try again. He assembled somewhere around 170,000 men, though only a fraction were true fighting troops, and marched them up the Danube. He arrived at Vienna on July 14th. Vienna was almost undefended. Emperor Leopold I had fled to Passau days earlier with most of his court. The city had perhaps 16,000 regular defenders under the command of Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, plus armed civilians and militia. But Leopold had done one thing before he ran. He had signed a treaty with the King of Poland, Jan Sobieski III, promising Polish military assistance if the Ottomans marched on Vienna. Sobieski was 54 years old, a veteran of 2 decades of border warfare against Ottomans and Tatars. He had crushed a Turkish army at Kotin in 1673. He was probably the finest cavalry general in Europe, and he took his treaty obligations seriously. Vienna held out for 60 days. Kara Mustafa had brought only light artillery, so he did what the Ottomans always did. He tunneled. Ottoman miners worked their way toward the walls, planting massive gunpowder charges. The defenders countermined. By early September, sections of the Vienna walls were beginning to collapse. The starvation inside the city was almost total. Rats sold for coins in the streets. Then, on September 6th, Sobieski crossed the Danube northwest of Vienna at the head of about 20,000 Poles, including a corps of the most famous cavalry in Europe, the Polish winged hussars. The hussars were something out of a nightmare. Each rider wore a wooden frame on his back that carried tall feathers, painted or gilded, so that at full gallop the hussars appeared to have wings, 3 or 4 meters high. The wings hissed in the wind. Some historians believe the sound spooked enemy horses. Others say the wings were symbolic. Either way, the psychological effect was real. The hussars carried lances longer than any pikeman's weapon, up to 5.5 meters long, made hollow to be light in the hand and rigid enough to punch through 3 files of infantry in a single charge. They had not been defeated in a major battle for over a century. Sobieski's Polish force linked up with imperial troops under Duke Charles V of Lorraine, and German contingent from Saxony under John George III, and from Bavaria under Maximilian II Emmanuel. The total Holy League army was about 70,000 to 80,000 men, still outnumbered, but united under Sobieski's command. On the night of 9/11, they moved through the Vienna woods and up onto the ridge of the Kahlenberg, the mountain overlooking Vienna from the northwest. When Sobieski looked down at the Ottoman camp in the morning of September 12th, he is said to have muttered, "This man is badly encamped. He knows nothing of war. We will defeat him easily." The battle began at dawn on September 12th. The Imperial and German forces on the left descended from the Kahlenberg and engaged Kara Mustafa's right-wing. Fighting was fierce. The Ottomans held. Kara Mustafa, distracted by the tunneling and hoping to still take the city before the relief force could break him, split his attention between the walls and the ridge. It was a fatal mistake. Through the afternoon, Sobieski held back the Polish right wing, waiting. He had originally planned to attack on September 13th. The other commanders convinced him to attack that same day, by 5 in the afternoon. The Ottoman line was buckling under imperial pressure but had not yet broken. Sobieski gave the order. Around 5:30 p.m., the largest cavalry charge in human history began coming down the mountain. Estimates of its size vary. Some sources say 14,000 cavalry, others say 18,000, others say 20,000. At its point, riding in the front rank alongside Sobieski himself, were about 3,000 of the elite winged hussars. The ground shook. The Ottoman lines below heard the sound before they saw the riders. Then the wings crested the ridge, and for the first time in Christian history, 3,000 pairs of huge wooden wings poured down a mountain in a single wall. The Ottoman right wing collapsed in perhaps 15 minutes. The Ottoman center unraveled. Kara Mustafa, watching from his tent, ordered a fighting retreat, then a general retreat, then a rout. The whole Ottoman army came apart before the sunset. 3 hours after the charge began, the Ottoman camp was in Christian hands. Sobieski walked into Kara Mustafa's tent that evening, took the Grand Vizier's own horsehair standard, and wrote to his wife Marisinka a famous letter that began, Veni vidi Deus vicit. I came. I saw. God conquered. Kara Mustafa escaped that night with a handful of guards. He fled south with what remained of his army harassed by hussars all the way to Belgrade. When he reached Belgrade in December, a sultan's messenger was waiting for him. He was strangled with a silk cord in the traditional Ottoman manner, several men on each end, pulling on Christmas Day, 1683. His head was sent to Constantinople and displayed on the palace gates. Vienna, 1683, was the moment the tide reversed. From that day until the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, and from Karlowitz until the Treaty of Kukuk-Kainarka in 1774, and from there until the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1923, the empire retreated. 236 years of slow, painful, sometimes reversed, but always eventual retreat. The 300 years of terror that had begun at Kosovo, Polje, in 1389 ended at the Vienna woods in 1683, because on that day, the winged hussars arrived, and they came down the mountainside, and they turned the tide. If you enjoyed this journey through 300 years of European nightmares, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to show these stories to more history fans who deserve to know them. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these 10 battles you had heard of before this video and which one you had never heard of at all. Tell me where you are watching from. This community stretches across every continent and every time zone, and knowing where you are makes this feel less like shouting into a microphone and more like a conversation. If you want to hear the story of the 2 battles I could not include in this list, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the last stand of Nicholas Zrinski at Zigitvar in 1566, both live in the video on the greatest last stands in history. Go watch that one next. Thank you for watching. History remembers the winners. It should also remember the men who died so that the winning could happen at all.